皆さん、こんばんは。また明けましておめでとうございます。日本クラブ事務所長の前田正明です。本日はお忙しい中、在ニューヨーク日本国総領事館、ニューヨーク日本商工会議所、日本クラブ共催の新春オンラインレクチャーによるウェビナーにご参加いただきまして、本当にありがとうございます。本日はバイデン政権における国際法と題しまして、ニューヨーク大学国際法教授、米国アジア法研究所所長でいらっしゃいます、ホセ・アルバレス教授をお迎えします。4年間のトランプ政権で大きく変化しました米国と米国同盟国、または国際機関との関係を次期バイデン政権で元に戻るのかどうかというのが論点の中心に据えてお話を伺いたいと思います。本日は議会でも大きな混乱が起きて、ワシントン DC はだいぶ混乱しているようではございますが、どういうふうな方向になっていくのか非常に注意深く見つめたいと思います。アルバレズ教授のプロフィールについては、この後、今回教材をいただいております総領事館の村上さんよりご紹介をいただきます。本日のウェビナーはこれから40分間、アルバレズ教授にレクチャーをいただき、その後、約15分間、視聴者の皆さんから Q&A の時間を設けております。教授は皆さんの活発な質疑応答を期待されておりまして、何回も念を押されておりますので、ぜひご質問のある方はご遠慮なく、講義の途中でも結構ですので、Q&A ボタンでテキストを事前にお送りください。ご質問には本日チャットは使えません。チャットでは、受け付けないわけではないですが、チャットは使わない方向でいきたいと思いますので、ご了承ください。また、本日のレクチャーは英語でございますけれども、ワードリーのサービスによります日本語のサブタイトルも用意してあります。クローズドキャプション、画面下の CC ですね。こちらをボタンを押していただきますと、ご覧いただきます。必要に応じてどうぞご利用ください。それでは、領事館のジャパンインフォメーションセンター所長の村上健二さんより、アルバレズ教授のご紹介をいただきたいと思います。村上さん、こんばんは。
こんばんは。在ニューヨーク日本総領事館の広報センターの村上でございます。今晩よろしくお願いいたします。
どうもこんばんは。教授ご紹介いただきまして本当にありがとうございます。教授をご紹介いただくのはもちろん村上さんなんですが、教授とはどのようにお知り合いになられたんでしょうか。いわゆる、
はい、
ありますか。そういう意味では。
はい、実は94年に私がミシガン大学というところに留学した際に、
はい、
アルバレズ先生から国際法を教えていただいたというご縁があります。
人柄なんていうとちょっとあれですけども、どんなお方なのか、ちょっと簡単にお話しいただければと思いますけど。
はい、とにかく先生は議論がお好きな気さくな方で、若い人とも分け隔てなく議論をされるという方です。ですので、今日もぜひ皆さん積極的に質問を出していただくようにお願いいたします。
はい、どうもありがとうございます。では、教授のご紹介も含めまして、村上さんにちょっとバトンタッチさせていただきたいと思います。では、よろしくお願いします。
はい、改めまして、在ニューヨーク日本総領事館の村上でございます。本日よろしくお願いいたします。ホセ・アルバレズ先生は、ハーバード大学、それからハーバードロースクールをご卒業の後、国務省の法律顧問部やまた弁護士事務所等に勤務されて、それからロースクールの先生になられました。まさに最初の頃にですね、今をさること25年前ですけど、ミシガン大学にいらして、その時に私が教えていただいたと。で、その後、コロンビア大学等を経られて、2009年からニューヨーク大学の教授をされています。で、国際広報、インターナショナルパブリックローが、ご専門なわけですけども、特に国際機関、それからあと投資紛争の処理といったところがご専門というふうに理解しています。で、昨年にはニューヨーク大学のその米国アジア法律研究所、 US Asia Law Institute というところの所長に就任されています。それではここから英語に切り替えさせていただきます。はい。Professor Alvarez, thank you very much for joining us today, and I'm sorry to have kept you waiting. I've been talking about my experience as your student and how to get a good grade from you. That is to actively participate in the discussion. Yesterday, we saw quite a drama in the state of Georgia, which could have a big impact on the control of the Senate, which is one of today's topics. Today, we are witnessing even more dramatic developments, both in and out of the Capitol. All in all, it turned out that your lecture on the new administration couldn't be more timely. Today, the members of the Japan Chamber of Commerce and Industry, mostly corporate representatives, and Japanese lawyers conversant with the US legal system and practicing in New York and Tokyo are joining us. Without further ado, I ask Professor Alvarez to speak on international law in a Biden administration. Professor Alvarez, please.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be asked, and you are quite right. This is a rather unusual and historic time to discuss this. And of course, what I'm trying to do here is trying to predict as best as I can how the Biden administration will handle international law issues. And I'll try to be as comprehensive as I can. But obviously, I'll look forward to your questions that can direct to particular issues. And I want to stress that mine are predictions, not necessarily my own assessments of what should happen, but based on my own assessments of the politics, what will probably happen. But of course, if you had asked any of us what would probably happen in 2020, back in 2019, I think many of us would have been very wrong. So you can take all that I say with a grain of salt. My first prediction is that yes, despite what happens today in the Capitol, there will be an inauguration of a new president on January 20th. The Electoral College votes will be affirmed despite what happened today. So that's my first prediction. Now, as far as international law is concerned, I do have, and I was urged to provide a little PowerPoint to assist. It's not comprehensive. So if someone could turn on the PowerPoint now, that would be a great idea, and share it with the participants. As far as international law is concerned, Trump was a consequential US president. Many international lawyers are rightly celebrating what we assume is a restoration of international law. Now, can I ask whether the PowerPoint is now visible on the screen? Yes, okay.
Yes,
great.
visible.
Oh, great. So if we can go to the first slide. So the second slide, sorry, slide 2. So this is a picture of two monsters, and what it represents is the lower monster is certain tendencies that U.S. had with respect to international law that the Trump administration just increased in size. So this is not to suggest that these were new things that Trump introduced into U.S. foreign policy, but that he cemented certain characteristics that I think are likely to outlast the Trump administration, and that will make the restoration of international law under a President Biden a bit more sobering, a bit more tempered, a bit more measured. So if you can go to the next slide, slide 3, these are the 8 characteristics that I'll be addressing, and I'm going to suggest that many of them will still be recognizable aspects of U.S. foreign policy, even under a Biden administration. The first is a preference for non-treaty commitments with other countries that do not require approval of either one house or both houses of the U.S. Congress. Second is a more hostile, a more wary approach towards China. Third is a deep skepticism of the world trading system and free trade agreements and the WTO. Fourth is a continued reliance on trade sanctions to punish what the United States considers to be bad actors. Fifth is a cautious and sometimes disinterested attitude towards the UN system, the UN itself, and UN specialized agencies, which is quite ironic for a country that established or helped to establish at the end of World War II that very UN system. Six is opposition, continued opposition to most forms of international adjudication, that is, most forms of international courts and tribunals. Seventh is an opposition to what Biden and Trump and others have called never-ending wars, including use of force for humanitarian intervention. And eighth is an ever more ironclad commitment to Israel's security. Now, a Biden administration can be expected to modify at the margins each of these, adopt a much more measured diplomatic tone. But make no mistake, I would predict that many of these tendencies will still be there, even at the end of a Biden administration. And some of this will be the product of the world that Biden has inherited. But some is the result of who Biden is. President Biden will not set out to systematically dismantle everything that is associated with his predecessor, President Trump. Unlike Trump, which some people call termination man, who sought to undo all things Obama, Biden is too careful, too thoughtful, too bipartisan, too rational, too respectful of rule of law to imitate Trump in that same way. This is particularly likely to be the case if Biden continues what is apparent even today, his overriding effort to unite the red and the red states, the blue states of the United States in an equally divided nation. And some of these reasons for this constraint are due to structural constraints that Biden has inherited. These include a more or less evenly divided Congress, despite the control of Democrats in both houses. It's a very, very tight vote in each Congress, in each house. A more resistant and conservative federal judiciary that may affect how international law is used in US law. And the path dependency of civil servants, what the Trump supporters call the deep state, as well as limits under the law on how you can reverse quickly federal regulations. Federal regulations are much harder to reverse as opposed to executive orders, which Biden can relatively quickly reverse. So in my limited time, let me just highlight how these foreign policy trends will continue to cast their shadow over the new administration. So if I can go to the next slide, I'll start talking about the multilateral treaties and the structures that inhibit that. So as you see in this picture from William Blake illustration, Biden is severely constrained on making treaties that require approval of both or either house of Congress. Even with Democratic majorities, the hold is very, very thin. Basically, President Harris has to cast, for example, the majority vote for the Democrats, assuming today's wins in Georgia hold up. So what this means is that the first 100 days of the Biden administration will not be filled with new ratifications by the US to multilateral treaties that much of the civilized world, including Japan, joined many, many years ago. Even now, with Democrats in control of the Senate, we should not expect the US to ratify the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, or the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, or the American Convention of Human Rights, or the Rights of the Child Convention, or even the Law of the Sea Convention, or the Statute of the International Criminal Court. Even though that's many of the treaties that international lawyers would like the Biden administration to ratify, that's not going to happen. do not expect the Biden administration to remove the U.S. reservations to the Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, or even its reservations to the Torture Convention. Remember, this is a country that took 40 years to ratify the Genocide Convention. A country like that does not change its spots so quickly, and much of the world, and not only the U.S., has these days not been that happy with new ambitious treaty making anyway. To be sure, President Biden will fulfill his promise to have the U.S. rejoin the Paris Agreement on climate change, because he can do that without congressional approval as an executive agreement. And over time, Biden may pursue other international efforts that are consistent with Pope Francis's plea to protect the planet in his encyclical Laudato Si. This is the Pope's encyclical on climate change. Now, since the US and China jointly account for 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions, Biden will try to reignite the US-China bilateral climate relationship that was begun under President Obama. The US is likely to join China in pledging to lower the level of its carbon emissions by 2050, and it can do some progress to that by changes in EPA policies and to climate change mitigation that US states are doing, and that may assist even if Congress were not to pass legislation to do this. Biden may also attempt a joint US-Chinese cooperation agreement that would tap into the two countries' respective strengths. That is, US talents in inventing new technologies and China's capacity to commercialize and cheaply produce clean energy technology, such as solar panels. And a Biden administration might also embrace related international initiatives that were rejected by Trump, such as the 2018 Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration. That soft law pact can help to address the dilemma of climate change migration. There may be, to be sure, exceptional cases where President Biden will attempt to secure a new bilateral treaty. He is likely to try to revive the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty with Russia that Trump terminated due to Russia's violations, for example. Unlike Trump, Biden is rightly worried about escalating the nuclear threat to the world. Now, there are many reasons that for this approach, that is, executive agreements, soft law agreements, agency actions at the national level, rather than ratifying treaties. If I can go to the next slide, slide 5, please. So the internal constraints are evident to many of those listening, which is that many US treaties have to be approved by 2/3 of the Senate, and even House congressional executive agreements only require a majority of both, but that does require a majority, and there are some Democrats who are not likely to join some of these efforts. And it's been clear since the Obama years, the US Constitution and Capitol Hill traditions make concluding treaties very difficult purposely. Obama tended to go for international agreements that were already authorized under existing US law. For example, under the trade protection, trade agreements, free fast track, for example, trade promotion authority. He already had authority to conclude some treaties because Congress had given him that authority. Or if a law says you can conclude a treaty because a prior treaty authorized it, that is another way. So there are ways to have a treaty that do not require congressional action or require implementing legislation. But Biden is not likely to find many members of Congress whose top priorities include ratifying a particular treaty. And for example, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea is a case in point. The US has a huge interest in defending the law of the sea, and they're ever stronger than ever before, given the continuing threats to international peace posed by China's actions in and around the South China Sea. And yet no one predicts that the Biden administration will spend the political capital needed to secure US ascension to that convention. not only because there does not appear anyone in the Senate who really cares enough to push it, but also because the US, no less than China, has no apparent present interest in using that treaty as a tool for settling law of the sea disputes through the modes of impartial international adjudication that treaty to some extent compels. Another reason for continued timidity on treaty initiatives is the continuing relevance of that populist mindset that drove Trump to the White House and very nearly kept him there. A Biden presidency, as this last part here in this slide indicates, a Biden presidency is likely to prioritize what the former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, calls intermestic issues. That is, international initiatives that have a clear domestic policy significance, and therefore are likely to draw support from even the many sovereigntists who are now dominating the US Capitol. Biden will never utter the phrase America first, like Trump did, but that sentiment will compel him to justify every foreign policy action he takes in terms of how it will benefit the people of the United States. In his what may be just a single term, Biden will spend precious political capital on filling out what international lawyers want only insofar as those things further the interest of his target audience, which is blue-collar workers on Main Street. He will justify the re-entry into the Paris Agreement and sell it to the US public on the basis that it is needed to make sure that Main Street is not flooded, burned to the ground, or torn apart by hurricanes thanks to climate change. He will tell us that we should return to the WHO and its global scripts for testing, for contract tracing, for isolation. And that's justified, he'll say, not because of some abstract commitment to multilateralism, but just on the simple basis that this is needed to keep more Americans alive and Main Street open for business. This turn to intermestic or domestic law rationales can be a recipe for enhancing US compliance with international law. Even without passing new laws, we can expect a Biden administration to have and use the executive branch to protect the rights of African Americans by a less moribund rights division of the US Justice Department. Proactive enforcement of civil rights encouraged by the Black Lives Movement, changes to how law enforcement officers are disciplined and prosecuted for their actions at the state or municipal level, greater prosecutions of threats and acts by white supremacists, including today's, rules that eliminate private prisons and that reduce criminal penalties. All of these things will enable the US to have much better answers the next time the US reports to the Committee under the Racial Discrimination Convention or other human rights committees of the UN. Should the US return to the UN Human Rights Council, which I think is likely under a Biden administration, it may even support an attempt to appoint a commission of inquiry to investigate racism in law enforcement that might include investigating those things even in the United States. Attention to the unequal racial impact of both the current pandemic and climate change will also enable Biden to draw connections between international human rights and his other principal intermestic priorities. There are predictable efforts he will make to defend the rights of US organized labor, and that may elevate the status and the credibility of the US with respect to international labor rights and in the International Labor Organization. Genuine efforts by Biden's Justice Department to correct and prevent pervasive forms of gender discrimination, the expected lifting of the global gag rule barring US aid to entities that support reproductive rights around the world. These are the kinds of things that will enhance the credibility of the US before human rights bodies, even if the US does not join CEDAW. Biden, who as vice president got ahead of his own president by endorsing same-sex marriage, is also likely to embrace a global LGBTQ agenda identified in the Democratic Party platform. He will eliminate the transgender ban on military service. He will appoint senior leaders at the State Department, USAID, the National Security Council, who support LGBT rights as a priority. With respect to immigration, eliminating the policy of separating immigrant children from their parents, reversing other Trump executive orders that relate to immigration, and that includes taking action on what we call dreamers, folks who came to the U.S. as children and have lived here their whole lives, and let them stay in the United States, eliminating the revamped Muslim ban, reversing constraints that Trump imposed on rights to asylum and non-refoulement. All of these things will make the U.S. more compliant with a number of human rights instruments, including the torture and refugee conventions. These and other changes to Trump executive orders, and you can expect many more. I know some of you are interested in the many executive orders that have imposed constraints on foreign students that can come to my university, for instance. I would predict those, as well as executive orders constraining foreign journalists, will be among the many that will be reversed or stopped immediately upon Biden's coming into office. This is the principal way that I think that the Biden administration will attempt to restore some of the US's lost soft power on human rights, as well as the ways he will attack the pandemic and make some progress on climate change. So what about that second foreign policy trend, hostility towards China? Well, can I have the next slide, please? So views of China. So now we're going to slide 7, please. Thank you. So views of China within the United States have hardened to a point where the only question among some possible foreign policy advisors is just which path China intends to take to achieve China's global domination. President Biden will be far more nuanced with respect to China than Trump was. He has described China as the US's principal adversary, its sole strategic competitor for leading power status. That's a careful mention. It clearly does not seek to have a decoupling with China, nor a descent into a US-China Cold War. Like the picture demonstrates, it's a calculated, strategic approach, I would predict, towards China. So if we can go to slide 8, please. Biden will follow the expression from the Mao era in China to walk on 2 legs. He will treat China as a hostile power, sometimes, as a strategic competitor, sometimes, and as an ally, sometimes, all as needed to advance distinct US goals. A Biden administration will make it clear that it will consider certain Chinese actions, such as interference with transit rights on the high seas, arbitrary arrests of foreigners, or perhaps a threat to invade Taiwan or the Senkaku Islands. All of these will be deemed unacceptable, hostile actions against the status quo. At the same time, the Biden administration will signal that it wants to cooperate on matters of common global concerns that are not just on climate change. That is, to permit US-Chinese joint efforts against terrorism, the spread of weapons of mass destruction, to preempt missile launches by North Korea. He will treat China as a competitor, that middle category, in the race of winning hearts and minds in the developing world by having US support infrastructure development projects that would hopefully respond to China's formidable Belt and Road Initiative. He will resist Chinese efforts to export Chinese industrial standards, including surveillance technology, along with its aid and foreign investments. What about that third foreign policy trend, skepticism of the world trading system? So if we can go to slide 9, please. So the WTO. The US disenchantment with the WTO as a forum for negotiating new trade rules to respond to new realities, as a place to effectively monitor how trade policies of states, as an effective forum for resolving trade disputes. All of these complaints predate the Trump administration, and I will predict will outlast the Trump administration. There is a bipartisan consensus within the United States, justified or not, that while the world has changed, the WTO has not. But Biden, like the US business community, will not engage in Trump's loose talk of simply leaving the WTO. He will try to re-engage with WTO reform. He has no interest in sliding down Trump's protectionist path, premised on tit-for-tat tariffs, and he has particularly no interest in imposing legally implausible tariffs on the US's traditional allies, including Canada or Europe. Steering that centrist path on the WTO will be a hard thing, given the Sanders-Warren progressive wing of the Democratic Party, as well as concerns across the aisle on the Republican side that the WTO's rules are ill-suited to liberalize trade in the age of digital trade, with respect to e-commerce, with respect to subsidies and forced tech transfers by non-market economies and their SOEs, given unfair special concessions given to relatively well-off and self-identified developing countries like China, as well as repeated failures by the WTO to police its own members when they take protectionist actions. Now, which part of a substantial WTO reform agenda that Biden has inherited, which part of it he will act on, remains a guessing game. His nominee for U.S. Trade Representative, Catherine Titi, is known as an astute negotiator who was able to bring the USMCA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, to successful conclusion despite opposition from the Democrats. So there is quite possible a very skilled U.S. trade representative coming to power. Now, despite skepticism of trade agreements that have accelerated in the age of Trump, Biden will probably seek to renew fast-track authority that would enable him to conclude very quickly free trade agreements through a quick up and down vote in Congress without Congress being able to attach amendments. And that up and down vote would be able to include implementing legislation. That fast-track authority expires in the middle of this year. And I would predict that Biden will try to have that fast-track authority reauthorized by Congress, which would have to be through legislation. And that's going to be a tough battle, given Democrats' opposition to free trade agreements. But I would predict that even if he wins that battle and he gets the authority to negotiate agreements under fast track or trade promotion authority, Biden has said that he is not inclined to conclude trade agreements in the immediate term. But I will also predict that even though that may be his inclination, he will face considerable pressure from business interests that are now face, especially U.S. business interests, that now face exclusion from emerging global supply chains as under the new regional and comprehensive economic partnership. If Biden were to react, his most likely route would be to restore some kind of a trade equilibrium vis-a-vis China by trying to return to the Trans-Pacific Partnership that Trump foolishly abandoned, but that would require considerable work and will encounter considerable resistance in a now Democratic-controlled Congress. If new Biden trade agreements do emerge, one can anticipate that they will also include new provisions to address climate change. So the fourth tendency that I talked about is continued use of sanctions on bad actors. A Biden administration is likely to keep in place many existing sanctions, particularly on China and Russia, but for different reasons. He will keep Russian sanctions for sure in place and possibly escalate them because of Russia's prior interference in U.S. elections, its seizure of Crimea, the bounties that Russia put on U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan, and now most recently, its involvement in the hacking of the Solar Winds operation. Continued trade sanctions on China may be premised on slightly different reasons than under Trump. on Hong Kong's security law, on China's treatment of the Uyghurs, that is, on human rights grounds, and less on the contention that, for example, China manipulates its currency or was responsible for transmitting the alleged China virus. This would be a 180 degrees shift in terms of the rationale for Chinese policies, because after all, President Trump reportedly stated to the president of China that building internment camps for the Uyghurs was, quote, the right thing to do. This is very different from what China what Biden will likely do. Now, if we can go to slide 10, please. This is the area where there's likely to be as much of a shift from Trump as anything else, and that is Biden knows that the U.S. Disengagement with UN institutions weakens rather than strengthens U.S. sovereignty. He knows, as apparently Trump did not, that the absence of the U.S. from UN system institutions leaves an absence that other states, particularly China, are willing to fill. And that is not good for the world or for the U.S. And his nominee for UN ambassador, veteran diplomat Linda Thomas Greenfield, suggests he has a serious interest in re-engaging with the UN, including its UN Human Rights Council and its UN specialized agencies like the World Health Organization. But at the same time, Trump's withdrawals and wariness with respect to UN system organizations, however misguided, provide Biden, and he will see it this way, as possible leverage to address longstanding complaints about those institutions. A Biden administration will attempt to resume global leadership of what remains of the global liberal international order by insisting or trying to insist on institutional reforms to make these entities work as intended. For example, if he goes back to the UN Human Rights Council, the Biden administration will express displeasure over the Human Rights Council's recent decision to admit China, Saudi Arabia, and Cuba to its ranks, remind the Council that its membership is supposed to take human rights records of those members into account, and he will also resist China-led efforts to turn that body's Universal Periodic Review into an empty celebration of human rights violators instead of what it was intended to be, to hold them to their feet to the fire. Biden will try to fix the WHO, not leave it. As a re-engaged member of the World Health Organization, the U.S. will pay the dues that Trump withheld, but also attempt to use its financial leverage to back institutional reforms and secure, despite continuing Chinese resistance, a genuine, candid assessment of what the organization did wrong from the time of the first COVID test through to the present day. He will agree that the failure of one state to prevent the spread of a contagious disease presents a common danger to all, and that all states benefit when each protects the health of its inhabitants. He will continue to be adverse to most international courts, including the ICJ and the International Court of Justice, but he can be expected to try to reform the WTO's appellate mechanism by accepting some of the reforms that the Europeans, for example, have proposed. But don't be mistaken. A Biden administration will not accept the jurisdiction of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights or accept the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights Protocol permitting individual complaints against the U.S. to be brought before the Human Rights Committee. He will not invest U.S. time and energy on European-backed proposals for new global courts that are popular in some circles. The proposal for a World Court of Human Rights, an International Environmental Court, an anti-corruption, anti-terrorism, anti-trafficking sets of courts, or even a multilateral investment court or an arbitration tribunal for business and human rights. But at the same time, Biden can be expected to adopt a kinder, gentler policy towards the International Criminal Court, even though he will continue to resist adherence to the Rome Statute or to the Kampala Protocol on Aggression. And the seventh tendency that I talked about is aversion to use of force. Biden was reportedly never a fan of going into Libya. And like Trump, he will be adverse to starting and staying in never-ending wars, even for humanitarian reasons. And at the same time, though, his administration will be more engaged in trying to make the UN Security Council relevant, if not great, again. Unlike Trump, he would support, for example, a future Security Council resolution to respond to pandemics as threats to international peace. And the Council had done that before with respect to Ebola. And finally, the seventh is the ironclad commitment to Israel. This will be very difficult for Biden to overcome. The U.S. Embassy is now relocated to Jerusalem. It's hard to change that. Trump's executive order recognizing the Golan Heights as part of Israel, the closure of the Palestine's diplomatic mission in Washington, all of these are facts on the ground that will probably not change. And despite considerably icier relations with Netanyahu, Biden will find it very difficult to be accepted as an honest broker for a broader Middle East peace. So where does that all leave us? Slide 11 tells us that what we're talking about, so if we can go to slide 11, what we're talking about is a tempered restoration of international law, but it's a restoration that will be tempered because of what slide 12 shows us, and that is, if we can go to slide 12, because we have witnessed a paralyzed UN system that has repeatedly failed to protect life. Biden is heir to deep-seated skepticism about the efficacy of international organizations to address problems of the global commons. And that is one reason why I would not predict that Biden is bringing us to effectively a third term of Obama with respect to foreign affairs. Every effort by President Biden to reset the clock to Obama time, it confronts new realities, assumes a different shape. 4 years of Trump have made restoring Obama-era policies difficult for another reason. Trump has managed to eviscerate trust that the U.S. can keep its word, or that having given it, it can actually do what it promises. This alone will complicate any renewed effort to seek the help of others on climate change, on restoring the WHO or the WTO, on closing Guantanamo, on rendering suspects accused of terrorism. It may take decades to restore a reputation lost in a scant 4 years. Even the U.S. traditional allies like Japan are aware that nearly half of U.S. voters supported a second term for an extremely unilateralist president, and that over half may yet elect another one in 2024 that is only slightly more competent. That reality means that NATO members will welcome Biden's expected new embrace of NATO, but will continue to assume that in the future they will need to have a plan B for securing Europe. No one can be sure how much time it will take to regain the trust of traditional allies whom we have spurned and reset the tone of discourse with authoritarian rulers that we have somehow befriended. And another factor that complicates attempts to return to Obama-era policies is that there's been a massive change in U.S. foreign and intelligence services. In addition to all parts of the government, Trump administration sidelined career diplomats, fired independent inspector generals, made enemies of foreign policy and intelligence agency whistleblowers. Many distinguished public servants have resigned or been forced out. He made a record number of political friends, incompetent ambassadors. As a result, the U.S. Foreign Service has reportedly experienced the biggest drop in applications in a decade, thereby reversing any progress toward recruiting a more diverse workforce. Now, Biden will try to reassert the value of apolitical intelligence, foreign policy expertise, and compliance with ethics. But he can be expected to take seriously the need to raise RACE, U.S. foreign policy, so that its diplomats look like the United States itself, with expected benefits to making the U.S. a more credible advocate of structural racism around the world. But making diplomacy professional again, even if Biden were to distribute MDPA, make diplomacy professional again, hats in lieu of the MAGA hats, that's not a sexy topic. It will be a tremendous lift for an administration facing unprecedented other challenges that have far more political salience. In the meantime, Biden will have to work with a decimated State Department that he has inherited, including leftover deputies that have now acquired the status of civil servants and will not necessarily depart with Trump. So some of those officials may not necessarily get with the new program, and the deep state, this time ironically on Trump's side, may continue to, for a time, delay, obstruct, and sometimes even derail the new president's priorities. But there is some hope here for that tempered restoration, and that's slide 13, please. And I know I'm running out of time. So slide 13, with this old-fashioned map from pre-World War I of U.S. allies back then, and notice it includes Russia as well as Japan, tells us that there is a single theme that's likely to define the Biden presidency, and that cuts most strongly against Trump's erratic belligerence, and it's likely to make it possible to resist almost all of those 8 foreign policy trends. And that is Biden's reliance on allies, his reluctance to go it alone. In his climactic speech at right before the election at Warm Springs, Georgia, Biden cited Pope Francis' other encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, fraternal openness, defined as openness that allows us to acknowledge and use the help of others. Biden's expected return to allies is not just grounded, perhaps, in Catholic faith and Fratelli Tutti, but geopolitical reality. The U.S. is no longer the sole superpower in the bloc, and it needs the help of others. He has argued that a key source of U.S. power is over competitors like China, is that the U.S. has lots of traditional allies, and that's his go-to response whenever he's asked about how he would handle threats from North Korea, Russia's actions in the Ukraine, common threats to democracy posed by cyber attacks, or China's malign behavior in the South China Sea towards Hong Kong or Taiwan, or with respect to trade or intellectual property. That is, Biden's go-to response is to go to designated allies. His response to the unfolding Pacific century, the rise of China, is to strengthen ties with key allies in the region, including Japan, South Korea, and Australia, to have robust engagement with institutions like ASEAN. His response to China's military assertiveness will be to continue to attend the care and feeding of the quadrilateral security dialogue, or Quad, that I've listed here between the U.S., Japan, and Australia. That includes joint military exercises of very impressive scale. He will turn to a reinvigorated transatlantic partnership to secure common solutions to governing big data flows that also respect privacy and to achieve energy security while combating climate change. He will seek Iraqi help to ensure the lasting defeat of ISIS, European partners to reinvigorate diplomacy to protect Syrians, and forms of Western hemispheric cooperation in this hemisphere to address the many problems with immigration, for example, from the South. Now, all of this would be dramatically at odds with the unilateralist inclinations of Trump. The search for allies is inherent in Biden's tendency to find common ground with his political opponents, whether in Congress or abroad. This is his instinct, is to elicit consensus by emphasizing fact over fiction, science over QAnon, deference to experienced diplomats over folks that just engage in transactions. So all of this leaves us with some faith that there will be a return to international law, and that there are some ironies here. The 2020 election demonstrates that the US politics continues to be defined by a sharp divide between values voters, who often identify as evangelical Christians, and secular, largely urban elites on the East and West coasts. Ironically, the presidential candidate most strongly backed by those secular coastal elites turns out to be a practicing Catholic who is apt to take seriously Pope Francis's call to defend common humanity and Fratelli Tutti and to protect the planet in the other encyclical Laudato Si. Our incoming president also seems inclined to take seriously those of us who still have faith that international law and its institutions can help achieve both of those goals. That is an occasion to celebrate, even on a day like today. Thank you, and sorry that I took a little longer than anticipated. I await eagerly your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor. It's a nice lecture. Thank you very much. Okay. We will enter to the Q&A session. Okay. Okay. We will start the Q&A session. 村上さん、ビデオをオンにしていただけますか。
はい、村上でございます。どうもありがとうございます。今までで質問が3つ来てるんですけれども、日本語での質問も可能ですので、どうぞ皆さんまだ今からでも質問を入れてください。Now, Professor Alvarez, thank you very much for your comprehensive lecture on the international legal environment facing the new administration. You stressed the factors which are likely to change or unlikely to change, including the domestic constraints, most notably the congressional structure and even constitutional structure. But having said that, maybe the first question is kind of stimulated by what is happening in Washington, D.C., but it reads, President Trump will try to keep his influence even after January 20th. Who are the politically powered supporters for Trump even after the new administration takes office?
Right. So basically, I would say it's all of those who are aspiring to run for office. Ironically, that includes Trump himself now, but it's Ted Cruz, who certainly wants to run in 2024. It's Marco Rubio, for instance. It's a couple of other senators who aspire to office. I will say that today's events especially will make it harder for them because they will have to distinguish what their efforts to support Trump from what's happening that looks like violence, which I don't believe the American people will support. But yes, I do think they will continue to be supporters of Trump, but they're put in a very unusual position because Trump's announcement that he plans to run in 2024, which I find incredible. I don't think that that's plausible, but he does have 70 million votes that he got, the highest of anybody except Biden himself. So I would say that the problem those supporters have is if Trump runs for office, they can't aspire to office. So it's a hard thing for them to support Trump. If Trump says he's not running, that's one thing. They can run as supporters of policy, but they can't tout their own president aspirations and support Trump if he's running for office himself. So this puts them in a bit of a bind, but I would say those are some of the most politically prominent supporters. There are also deep economic conservatives that are likely, for some very good reasons, to oppose policies, tax policies, for instance, that Biden will aspire to. And there will be resistance from some business interests in particular, and not just multimillionaires, as Bernie Sanders would say, to tax policies. So make no mistake, even with a narrow Democratic majority in both houses, it will be hard to do anything that requires new law in this environment.
Well, thank you, Professor. And the second question is about the U.S.-China relations. I now read it out. I understand the Biden administration will still have a hostile approach to China, while the effort will be more professional and systematic. And President-elect Biden does not want decoupling. Will it be easier for us to forecast how commercial tradings between U.S. and China will be like?
Well, precisely because it'll be more professional and systematic, and I would predict also often involve working with allies, I think it will be hard to be erratic. That is, people won't have to, including people in business, won't have to pay attention to the latest tweet. In fact, I would urge Biden to retire any tweet account, not use it at all, except for personal kitty pictures of his family, perhaps, and that's about it. That is, the policy by tweet where policy changes on a 24-hour notice, and that's about it, will, I think, be gone. But that will mean that we will have a bit more predictability. But I think it will still be hard to predict with accuracy, for example, which part of attacks on Chinese business will survive in a Biden. Will we still go after Huawei, but not TikTok, for instance, as two different kinds of Chinese companies? Will we draw distinctions between private, so-called private companies in China and state-owned enterprises? Will we draw distinctions that are based on logic as opposed to emotion when it comes to banning Chinese entities on the trading on the U.S. stock exchange, or using CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment, to block transactions? So it may be that we will have a more consistent policy, but it may not always be easy to predict which Chinese companies will face the brunt of attack. There is also tensions when you pursue policy for a number of reasons, and that will be Biden's approach. He will sometimes do it for human rights reasons, and not just because it poses a threat to the privacy of Americans whose big data is threatened. Trying to strike a balance between human rights concerns, national security concerns, and maintaining U.S. business interests who still want to be able to go into China and do business there, that's going to be a hard-fought battle. There are also going to be things that are unpredictable simply because of different parts of the Democratic Party. Some parts of the Democratic Party will care more about human rights and less about the interests of U.S. business going into China. And they will want a more harsh policy than perhaps some of the USTR people might want. We will see how that works out.
Yeah, thank you. And the last question we've got so far is about your final point of going with the allies or other partners rather than going unilaterally. As you can imagine, the top national security concern for Japan is North Korea. Hence, this question. In order to solve the nuclear issue of North Korea, an international framework like the six-party talk, would it be possible in the new administration?
Yes, I think so. I think even though we may have six-party talks, keep in mind that I think Biden's approach will still perceive that China is the most important ally in this, that is, potential ally. And so I think, if nothing else, the tendency for Biden administration to wage effective economic and other types of war against China will be tempered to the extent it thinks that it can use China as the way to help resolve the North Korea stalemate.
Okay, we are running out of time, but fortunately, we've just received a couple of very good questions. First, I think he's a lawyer in Tokyo. The professor indicates that Biden administration does not incline to come back to TPP2 in the immediate future, but also expects that business community may pressure them to do so. So my question is, around when and under what kind of political circumstances could Biden administration decide to come back to TPP? How and what extent China factor may affect the decision or consideration? Also, if the new administration so decides, do you expect that they can conclude renegotiation of TPP in 4 years while demanding new commitments to other participants that they may want to accept?
Well, the question suggests how hard it is for the U.S. to now come back to an agreement that's been established among 11 other states. So my prediction is that at least, well, first he has to deal with COVID, has to deal with economic constraints. There's so many other priorities that I suspect that at least in the first couple of years, I don't see him pursuing TPP. Of course, he would still have to try to get fast track approved. That will be the most immediate need. If he manages to get that, that will give him a sense of how much support there is in Congress for something like TPP. I was a strong supporter of TPP. 80% of the investment chapter's language is from the US bilateral investment treaty, even today. So that chapter, the investment chapter at least, is not something that would be terribly difficult if you were simply interested in going back to something on the investment side that looks like the US model of, say, 2012 bilateral investment treaty. But I think what the questioner obviously anticipates is lots of pressure by Democratic members of Congress to insist on changes, not just to the investment chapter, but to other parts of the TPP. And that would entail a renegotiation. Now, there is one possible way to do some of those changes, and that is the TPP 2 is filled with reservations and side letters that are effectively little treaties among Australia and Taiwan. Australia and say Peru. That is, different countries of the TPP have made side agreements among themselves. And I could envision the US trying not to renegotiate the entire thing, but doing a lot of that through those various side letters. But that also requires that the other states that are now parties to the TPP want the US badly enough to make those compromises. And I'm not sure they do. But I do think that the principal motivation for a Biden administration will be to resist China, to reestablish a U.S. Presence in global supply chains that it is losing, not just because of this, but now the EU investment pact is about to come into being. So we have lots of initiatives by China that I think would inspire U.S. business to really push for this.
Well, thank you, Professor. We are already running out of time, but since we have 2 more questions, I just want to briefly touch upon those 2 questions. So please answer kind of quickly to those questions. The first one is, again, U.S.-China. It's about Taiwan. Regarding relationship with Taiwan, will President Biden try to establish the formal relationship with Taiwan?
My suspicion is that he will try to maintain the status quo. That is, that he will not try to elevate matters. What is more interesting, I think, to speculate is what kind of threat to Taiwan would Biden tolerate without some repercussions? China has been pressing that envelope quite seriously in terms of flyovers and other things across that divide. And that's harder to predict. But absent that, I would think he would try to maintain the status quo and not try to provoke China by trying to elevate the status of Taiwan. Although I will say this, he will strongly support Taiwan's participation as an observer in a variety of UN system organizations, including the World Health Organization. I think it's very unjust that Taiwan was excluded as an observer. It had lots of competence on this. It would help the WHO to have Taiwan. And of course, it also helps Taiwan to be in the WHO. And I can see U.S. considerable effort to try to elevate Taiwan's participation in various UN system organizations.
And finally, it's very intermestic or more like a very domestic question, but it's a very well taken one. If President Biden had some health issue problem, then Vice President Harris will take the office. In that case, what is the most possible outcome in the 2024 elections and U.S. domestic and foreign policy?
That takes me far away from international law, and I'm afraid I'm not a good crystal baller on that. I do think that one of the things that helped Biden was the fact that he was regarded as a very known quantity by the American people. And that's less, of course, true of anyone younger than Biden. And that includes Vice President Harris. But it really takes me far out. I mean, I know that I sounded like I was able to read crystal balls on all sorts of things, but I was trying to stick to international law. So I'm going to duck on that one.
Well, thank you very much, Professor, for answering the question so kindly with plain language. Conversation with you reminds me of my days in Michigan Law School. Before we close, I thank you once again for joining us. All of us were able to learn a lot from your lecture. I hope this will lead to a better understanding and further promotion of business and academic exchange between Japan and the US. With that, I want to bring the floor back to Undersecretariat, Mr. Maeda. Again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Alvarez. Thank you. Nice lecture. どうも村上さんもありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。
どうもありがとうございました。じゃあ、私の方から最後に一つアナウンスですけれども、日本クラブと JCCI で、医療従事者の方々でお弁当差し入れるプロジェクトを実施しております。今年もずっとそのままやっておりますので、ぜひこの後 URL が表示されますから、ペーパルで任意の金額でご寄付をお願いできればと思います。また、アンケートのリンクもございますので、ぜひともお電話いただいて、今日のレクチャーについての感想をいただければと思います。新年迎えましたけれども、相変わらずのパンデミックということですが、ぜひ一日も早く縮小し、収束していって、皆さんとまたお会いできる日を楽しみにしております。本日はどうもありがとうございました。それでは失礼します。
ありがとうございました。
どうも、小川さん、ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much, Professor Alvarez.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor.